One morning, I opened a folder that was never meant for my hands. Inside it were documents that made my breath stop. Within 72 hours, I understood that an entire city was living on borrowed time, and the people responsible for keeping them safe were the exact same people burying the truth. If I stayed silent, thousands of innocent people would never know what was coming for them. If I spoke, I risked losing everything I had ever built my life around. That was the moment I realized that faith without courage is just comfort with a pretty name. By the end of this story, you will understand why exposing that truth nearly cost me everything I had ever believed was safe, and you will understand why I chose to speak anyway. To understand how I uncovered that impossible secret, I have to take you back to who I was before any of this happened. I was a nun. I had been one for over 20 years. My world was small, and I loved it that way. I woke before sunrise every morning for prayer. I worked in our convent's community outreach office, coordinating food deliveries, hospital visits, and emergency support for families who had nowhere else to turn. My life was built on routine, silence, and service. I was not someone who looked for trouble. I was someone who believed deeply that if you lived honestly and helped quietly, the world around you would eventually reflect that goodness back. I never imagined I would one day stand in the middle of something so much larger than myself that I would question whether I would survive it. The city I lived in was called Harlan Falls. It sat in the foothills of a mid-sized American valley, maybe 80,000 people, the kind of place where neighbors still waved from porches and the local paper ran photos of school fundraisers on the front page. On the surface, Harlan Falls felt safe, familiar, trustworthy. But I had been there long enough to know that a place can feel peaceful and still be hiding something underneath. I started noticing small things. A water main near the old industrial quarter had been repaired 4 times in 3 months, always quietly, always at night. Several families I visited in the East District had been complaining about rashes, nosebleeds, and their children coughing without clear cause. Doctors were attributing it to seasonal allergies, but I kept hearing the same symptoms from the same neighborhoods. The city's water authority had sent 2 new notices that fall reminding residents to use filters. Nobody thought much of it. I filed it in the back of my mind and kept moving. Then came the folder. In mid-October, I was volunteering at St. Catherine's Hospital 2 afternoons a week, helping coordinate donated medical supplies for low-income patients. One afternoon, an administrator named Gerald, a quiet man I had worked beside for 3 years, handed me a thick envelope by mistake. He thought it was the donation inventory report I had requested. It was not. Inside were internal memoranda exchanged between the city's Department of Public Infrastructure and a private contractor named Callaway Environmental Solutions. The dates went back 18 months. I almost put it aside. I almost walked it back to Gerald's desk without reading a word. But one phrase at the top of the first page caught my eye. It read, "Continued public disclosure of Reservoir B findings is not recommended at this time." I sat down. I read every page. What I found in that folder was not dramatic at first. It was mostly technical language, engineering assessments, and contractor correspondence, but I had spent years reading documents for our outreach programs, grant applications, government compliance reports. I knew how to find the meaning underneath the language, and what I found was terrifying. Reservoir B was the secondary water supply for the eastern half of Harlan Falls. It had been quietly contaminated by chemical runoff from a decommissioned industrial processing plant on the city's edge. The contamination had been discovered by the contractor's own environmental team over a year and a half ago. The levels of a particular industrial solvent found in the water exceeded federal safety thresholds by a factor that the report described, and I will never forget this phrase, as statistically non-trivial but politically inconvenient. The city had not issued a public warning. They had not shut down the reservoir. They had not contacted the EPA. Instead, they had quietly commissioned a second internal assessment, buried the first report, and authorized the continued use of Reservoir B while arranging what the documents called a phased remediation timeline that would conveniently conclude after the upcoming municipal elections. 80,000 people, half of them drinking contaminated water every single day. and the officials responsible for their safety had made a calculated decision to keep quiet until the timing was less damaging to their careers. I sat in that hospital hallway for 20 minutes without moving. Then I put the documents back in the envelope, slipped them into my bag, and walked home. My hands did not stop shaking until I reached the chapel. I told myself to be careful. I told myself to be sure. I did not want to be the woman who caused panic over a misunderstood document. So I started quietly. I went to Father Thomas, our pastor, a man I trusted completely. He listened, looked at the pages I showed him, and then told me he thought I should return the documents to the hospital and let someone more qualified handle it. I understood his fear. I did not agree with his answer. I reached out carefully to a former environmental science professor who occasionally volunteered with our food program. His name was Dr. Ellis, a retired man with no reason to lie to me. I described the chemical names and the reported concentrations without showing him the folder directly. He went pale. He told me the solvent I described was associated with long-term liver damage, neurological effects in children, and elevated cancer risk with prolonged exposure. He said at those levels, extended consumption over 18 months could have already caused measurable harm to the most vulnerable people in that district. I thought about every family I had visited in the East District, every child with unexplained symptoms, every mother who had been told it was just allergies. I went to City Hall. I asked to speak with someone in the Department of Public Infrastructure about water quality concerns in the East District. I was given a form and told someone would follow up within 30 business days. 2 days later, a man I did not recognize sat in a car outside our convent for over 3 hours. When I walked to the gate to look more carefully, he drove away. That was when I understood the scale of what I was carrying. My first ally was unexpected. A young journalist named Renata, who ran a small local blog that most people in Harlan Falls ignored, reached out to me after I had quietly asked one of our hospital volunteers whether she knew anyone trustworthy in the press. I met Renata at a diner on the far side of town. I told her almost everything. She believed me immediately, which made me nervous at first. Then she showed me something that stopped my heart. She had been receiving anonymous documents for 2 weeks, partial reports, flagged inspection records, water testing logs with handwritten annotations. Someone else already knew. Someone inside the system was trying to get the truth out and did not know how. Renata and I spent the next 3 weeks working quietly, carefully, and terrified every single day. She tracked down a retired city inspector named Howard who had filed a formal internal complaint about Reservoir B 14 months earlier. His complaint had been dismissed and he had been quietly reassigned. He had copies of everything. He had kept them in a storage unit outside the city because, as he told us, he had a feeling someone might eventually come looking for them. Howard's documents were the missing pieces. They showed the chain of decisions. They showed exactly who had been in the meetings where the cover-up was authorized. They showed emails where senior officials used careful language to avoid putting anything incriminating in writing, but the sequence of events made the intent undeniable. Then came the betrayal I did not see coming. Father Thomas contacted the diocese on my behalf, I learned later, not to help me, but to have my involvement quietly discouraged before I caused what he called unnecessary disruption to the community. 2 officials from the city visited the convent. They spoke with our Mother Superior. I was called into her office and told with great gentleness that my personal projects were affecting the convent's relationship with civic partners, and that perhaps I needed to step back and reflect on my responsibilities. I sat in that office and felt something shift inside me, not anger, not fear, clarity, because I thought about the East District families. I thought about the children, and I understood that silence at that moment would not be humility, it would be participation. It would make me part of the crime. I told my Mother Superior with all the respect I had ever shown her that I could not step back. I told her I loved this convent and everything it stood for, and that everything it stood for was exactly the reason I had to keep going. I walked out of her office and called Renata. We had 1 week. Renata had a contact at a regional investigative news outlet, a proper outlet with legal backing and editorial protection. She sent everything we had. Howard agreed to go on record. I agreed to go on record. The outlet's editor told us they would need 72 hours to verify the documents and prepare for publication. He also told us quietly that once this went live, there would be no taking it back. I spent those 3 days in the chapel more than I spent anywhere else. I was not asking God to protect me from consequences. I was asking for the steadiness to accept whatever came. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. By noon, it had been picked up by 3 state-level news stations. By evening, federal environmental authorities had opened a formal inquiry. The mayor's office issued a panicked statement confirming that Reservoir B had been temporarily removed from the municipal supply as a precautionary measure, which was the first honest sentence that office had produced in 18 months. Within 2 weeks, 4 senior city officials had resigned. Callaway Environmental Solutions was suspended from all public contracts pending federal review. The EPA opened a full contamination assessment of the reservoir and surrounding groundwater. Free medical screenings were arranged for East District residents, and the families I had visited, the ones with the rashes and the coughs and the children with headaches that nobody could explain, they finally had answers. As for me, I was asked to leave the convent, not formally expelled, but the pressure was clear and I chose to make it easier for everyone by going quietly. I found a room in a small boarding house near the East District. I continued doing the work I had always done, visiting families, organizing food deliveries, sitting beside people in hard moments, without a convent address, without institutional protection, just me, my faith, and the knowledge that I had done what I believed was right. People ask me sometimes whether I would do it again, whether it was worth what I lost. I think about those children, and I already know the answer. Here is what I believe after everything I lived through. Corruption does not survive because powerful people are too strong to be stopped. It survives because ordinary people decide the cost of speaking is too high. And truth, real truth that actually changes something, begins with one person deciding that silence is no longer something they can afford. I was not brave in any special way. I was just a woman who found a document that was never meant for her hands and could not unknow what she had read. If this story made you think, I want to ask you something honestly. Do you believe you would have risked everything to expose the truth in my place? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one, and I want to know what you think. And if this story reminded you that courage often begins with one ordinary act by one ordinary person, please share it. Because somewhere right now, someone else is holding a secret they are afraid to carry alone. Let them know they are not.